So as Joe might have alluded to earlier, I've been doing terrible things with Docker for a while. Pretty much it's been a hobby of mine to abuse software basically since I got started. I came from sysadmin life, so that's pretty much, oh, please. Thank you. Yeah. I've been abusing software since I started, yes. The sysadmin way of doing things. How many people here have one system that's running something legacy that you would absolutely love to kill? That's about what I thought. You're the people this is targeted at. So my name is Jim Perrin. I've been a member of the CentOS team for a little over a decade now, and I've been a sysadmin basically the entire time. For the last year and a half, I've been working for Red Hat, which has freed me up to spend more time doing lots of evil things and guessing about things that other people might want to do that could also be considered abuse to software. So that's pretty much what I've been playing around with for a while. Because this talk is what it is, I really feel the need to put a disclaimer up. Everything that you see here is an anti-pattern for how Docker is supposed to work. It is in no way intended to be best practice. It's horrible advice. And this is basically when you're sitting here looking like, okay, both of my options suck. Which one is the lesser of two evils? That's who we're aiming at. If you don't feel the need to drink after this talk is done, I have not done my job. First off, is anybody in here from Red Hat support at all? Is there anybody in here that I'm just going to make cry by saying these things? Okay, all right. So with all of the other talks that have been going on today, I'm sure most of you have an idea for Docker Basics. It allows you a lot of flexibility, and Docker has a few guidelines that they try to push out, one application per container, things. Yeah, ignore that. We're not talking about one application per container. We're talking about doing terrible things. The whole great for developers. For normal Docker stuff, that's absolutely the case. For this, no. This is about making the sysadmin's life easier and trying to deal with that one piece of software that you just can't kill and make it a little bit better. Most people, when they're talking about containers, they see the nice, easy flow. They're thinking DevOps. They're talking about new stuff. They're talking about web development. That's not what we're talking about. We're looking at containers. This is where old software goes to die. We're talking retirement planning for that one piece of hardware that you absolutely need to murder. Here's why this might be a good idea. If you look at taking an older piece of software and putting it into a VM, you're going to take a performance hit. It may not be much, but you're going to take a little bit of a performance hit. If you start looking at more modern hardware, you're going to take more of a performance hit. libvirt isn't necessarily the most friendly when you start talking about 10 gig network cards or passing video cards through. That's kind of where virtualization stumbles a little bit. Docker makes that a little bit easier because it's just a process on the machine. You're running the application, but essentially you get native access to the hardware. That's what makes it a little nicer. It's sandboxed, it's isolated, but it's still native to the hardware. So you can go a little faster. You can take advantage of newer hardware that may not be supported by, EL4, EL5, God forbid EL3. Who still has an EL3 box living? One of you. Okay, EL4. More of you. Okay. EL5. The majority. Okay. So we're all here to talk about older hardware and older software that, God, it should die. But it won't. So, okay. Other reasons why this might be a good idea. If you're looking at your application, that should be the attack surface. End of discussion. If you're dealing with something that's old and legacy, odds are it's got holes in it. God forbid, the people who are running EL4 and EL3, you know that you have unpatched things hanging around out there. If you put the application into a container, you reduce the attack surface to just that application and what you expose from that container. Now, obviously, Dan Walsh loves to talk about how you can escape containers, so you still have to do some planning around that. But this reduces the overall surface that makes you vulnerable. If you have that application floating around in a VM, it's a full machine. All your normal policies still apply. You still have to go through change management. You still have to do everything else and explain to people why you have something that's old, obsolete, and out of date still on the network, and you have to justify it every single time. Now you can point to the box and say, hey, it's CentOS 7. It's RHEL 7. It's totally fine. And it's a policy loophole because what you're doing is running an application on top of that box. And oops, we just worked around the system. People in HR, please don't shoot me for saying that. Sysadmins know this happens on a daily basis. When you start off by doing this, you need to take a low-level look at your application. And this is one of the things that makes Docker files themselves kind of a good thing. They have problems, no question. I'm not taking any of that away. But it forces you to take a lower look at the application that you're running. You need to walk through step by step and say, okay, what software does this application touch? How do I need to interface with it? What ports does it need to be exposed? Because basically when you're writing a Docker file out, you're writing a recipe for how to install that application and how to run that application. Who in here has experience with Docker files? A couple of you. Okay, great. Essentially, the key that you want to work with is test everything incrementally. As you're doing this, start small, work up, test a couple of things, make sure that does what you want to, tear it down, do it again with the next step added in. You had a question? Oh, just, okay, all right. So, moving on from that, that's kind of where we end the best practices, because that's what you should do for Docker. Not everything for your applications can be easily done through a Docker file. Who's had to install Oracle? Who's had to walk through the GUI installer and make sure I got Firefox here so I can see this, and I've got to have an X session. How do you script that? It's kind of a pain in the ass. You don't necessarily need to, because you can actually shell into a running Docker instance, do what you need to do, exit that instance, and then run Docker commit. Everything that you just did got saved. It's now in that container. You can export that container and move it where you need to. Now you have that application relocated. Sometimes you need to do a little bit more than that. One of the ways that I cheat with this is I think about how I'm going to start this application. And a lot of the times when I do this, I use a start.sh or startup.sh, whatever. I have a script that I run that sits in that container's root directory. And when I need to shell into it, I edit what I need to do for the startup for that script. When you build a container, you get one way to say, hey, this is what I'm going to do. This is how I'm going to start the container. If you start it with a script, when you shell into the container, you can edit that script later on, save it, Docker commit, and it runs that script as you want it to later on down the road. This is where I'm saying it's an anti-pattern, because once you do this, you can never go back. Next time you try to do a build against that Docker file, you get the original before you've started doing this. So we're deviating and we're doing stuff Docker does not want you to do. Supervisor D is also a great way to cheat, because if you're using that, you can actually start up multiple things inside the container. Again, anti-pattern, stuff you should not be doing. But we're not talking about proper steps. We're talking about what I need to do to make stuff happen. Once we get into this, who's heard of pets versus cattle? Okay. That legacy server that you've had to limp along forever, that's kind of your pet. You've got to baby it along. Docker's targeted at your cattle. Tear down the machine, rebuild it. That's your Docker container. That's how we're doing things. That's how they do things. We're doing things a little bit differently. This is your pet now. Welcome. Have I lost anybody so far? Is anybody completely and totally terrified for how we're doing things? If you're not saying you're terrified, you're not listening. Intermediate evils that we can pull off in our container files. Use your volumes. If you do volume mounts, you get access to the host, so you can shift stuff around and save it and commit it back as you need to. It's a really easy way to copy stuff. It lets you do, if you want to share out, say, temp.x11 Unix, for example, you can share an X session. It's fantastic. If you get the permissions on it right, You're running Firefox or whatever GUI application you need, say the Oracle installer or anything else, right there in your container. Just commit when you're done. It's saved. You're good. Next time you run the container, throw a different volume in there. Hey, now you're looking at your U0 or your U01, and there's all your Oracle data. Pollute your environment. Docker makes it really easy to throw environment variables in things. Use them wherever you think you need to. It'll actually make your experience doing the user side of things kind of nice because you can pass different things in. You can assign different usernames each time you run the container. It lets you do just tremendous amounts of evil. Because we're doing this, you may also need to adjust the capabilities. And in more recent versions of Docker, you get the ability to say, hey, I need to add the capability for sysadmin network. Now I can change host networking from the container. That gets a little evil. You can do that with a number of other things too. So if you need to adjust things, you can throw cap sysadmin or a number of other things in there, or even just give it a /privileged. Just give it everything. Let it do whatever you want, because we're talking about evil things here, not necessarily best practice. Yeah, you can share X. This is pretty much how you do it. It's horrible. I don't recommend it unless you have to. So the last one on the list. Yes, you can actually set IPC equals host and share shared memory with your host. Why would you want to do this? God only knows. When I was talking with a couple of high-frequency trading firms that work out of Houston, and they hate to be called high-frequency traders, even though that's what they are. God love them, they're people. They wanted to have applications where they were sharing shared memory because that's how their application was written. And at the time, that wasn't necessarily possible with Docker. And I was like, oh, thank God, there's some sanity left. They shouldn't be doing this anyway. And then the new version came out, and we have it. So congratulations, we can share memory. So the good thing that's actually up here that I do like is the net equals host. That does make things nice. It makes things easy. If you're trying to work around the traditional -P for, hey, I need to map ports to host ports, or I need to map things, and then I have to find another way to expose the network, you don't really have to do that. The net equals host lets you just access the host's network from the container and move on with life. So if you need port 80 open or port 8043 or whatever, you can just do that and you're fine.
Does that work with like FTP where the support
It does. It does the mapping back and forth. Before, FTP was a pain in the ass because you had to identify your ports and the range of ports. And so you were throwing -P and some wildcard information in there or just assigning a range to it. Here, you don't have to do this. With net equals host, you're giving that container direct access to the host networking, so it just magic happens.
Does that mean inside the container, if config shows you the same interface?
Uh-huh. Evil. Evil things. Yes, you can do them. Alternate approaches. So for those of you running EL4, EL3, things like that, there are issues with generating a regular Docker container. The way that we do it, we have a kickstart that we build the image from and dump it into essentially a tarball and then import that into Docker. When you do it the normal way, you run into problems because the RPM format has changed between 6 and 7 versus what was in 3, 4, and earlier versions of 5. So the formatting is different. From 5 to 6, we worked around that with essentially DB4 export and import trickery, but we can't get away with that for older versions. So do your install in KVM. If you can install it in KVM, you can make a container out of it. Throw it in an image file, virtar out, dump the resulting tarball into your Docker file, or into Docker directly with Docker import. Yes, you can do it with EL3 as well. If you want to get really terrifying, you can go back and do it with 2 and with other earlier versions. As long as you can install it in a container or into a VM, you can do it. Some of you were thinking, hey, wait a second, 2 wasn't x86-64, it was just 32-bit. That's totally fine. It works anyway, at least right now. I've heard rumors that feature's going away. The downside is what you need to do is take a couple of 64-bit libraries from EL7 and inject them into that 32-bit container. Because Docker's going to put little pieces of itself in there to adjust your networking and do things like that, and it's going to expect some of that. And if you give it just enough 64-bit libraries, and there's 3 that it needs to work, it'll do the magic for you. So you can have a 32-bit container with a couple exceptions, and it just kind of goes along and does its thing. Don't ever do this. It's a terrible thing.
You mentioned networking. Is there any other parts of the OS that need to be supported?
No, it works just fine. It's basically 3 libraries that the Docker executable needs to go inside and set some basic information about the container outside the container for Docker. As long as it can handle that talking, all the normal tools still work. For now. Again, my disclaimer. As a sysadmin, I don't have to like what I'm doing. I just need to make it happen sometimes. Who here has been told that or said that themselves? Yeah, it happens. We know. I've said this entire time, we're talking about terrible things. It's the lesser of 2 evils. So, yeah, Joe mentioned this earlier. As an example of evil, I was looking around for something that had a nice, install shield kind of thing. I thought, hey, maybe I'll take FlexLM. Who in here's had to work with FlexLM? Great, okay. I went and I asked the FlexLM guys, hey, can I have a copy of your software? And they're like, sure, why? Because I want to showcase doing evil things with software. We changed our minds. You can't use it. Okay, fine. What else is out there? What else can I abuse? Well, there's a couple of things, but this seemed appropriate. So with this, I'm running 32-bit wine inside a container to run the installer for Internet Explorer. There's a couple of things you got to do with wine tricks to make this work, but it's the container that's the fun part to this. It's not necessarily the things that you have to do with wine tricks. That's documented, that's handled. But this lets you take all of the evil things that would ordinarily be on your system as a sysadmin making you cringe and isolate them to one specific area. They can live in their sandbox. Somebody can still use IE to do web development and make sure stuff renders properly and that the CSS is appropriately box shifted off to the side so it doesn't quite render the way you want to in IE. And you get to do things. And I thought, you know what, this is a really terrible example. This is fine. I can move on from this. No. I'm just going to leave that one up there and let you guys drink that in. Someone out there has always done something worse than you. We've covered a lot of evil. Folks, yeah, okay, yes.
So, if I have a non-reinstallable EL3 environment sitting on a server,
Mm-hmm.
is there any way to containerize that? And get the image somehow?
This is on Iron or in a VM? If it's on Iron, you could try to do a P2V conversion and see if maybe that works. I'm not sure if the P2V tools would allow you to do that. I haven't actually looked at doing that, but that would be interesting to see. Out of curiosity, why is it not relocatable? Are you tied to MAC address or? Okay, we're talking about evil here, not demon spawn for WebSphere, so I did. And I'll go back to my previous slide. Someone's always done something worse than you. So yeah, that's actually a good question. And for that, I would, if It's going to be a non-destructive thing. I'd try a P2V and just see if that worked, and then from that virtualized container, or from that virtual machine, if that works, dump it with virtar out and see if it loads up in Docker. When you're doing that, you don't necessarily need to make sure that all of the pieces are still there, because you're not going to need a kernel. It doesn't need to boot. You can clear out large chunks of the system. Just go in and start nuking stuff. It'll be fine, trust me. Yes?
So along those lines, you showed us a line where you said to dump out the
Oh, for
whatever.
that one? Yes.
You're getting the entire OS image.
Yes.
At that point.
Which is why I said go in and feel free to strip stuff out.
And that's now your base. You're going to turn that into your base Docker image.
That actually becomes a base Docker image, yes.
You're just clean out stuff you don't need
Right.
in that.
So you can go into that and yum uninstall kernel, or yum remove kernel, or whatever else.
And it running or anything like that.
Nope. No, at that point, it's still your bog standard Docker container. It's just bloated with additional stuff you don't need. So you can go in and strip it out. In theory, you would do that with a kickstart. If we were doing best practice for terrible things, yeah, we'd go in with a kickstart, and at the end of the kickstart in post, RPM-E, whatever, for the packages that we don't need. If we're going that far back, that would be, kudzu, the kernel. Yes, kudzu. I said evil things.
I forgot about that.
I'm sorry, I brought it up then. So if you clear it out, but you don't necessarily have to do that, you're just left with a container that takes up way too much space, and part of it's not going to be used or touched ever. There is that. If you're willing to sacrifice disk space and a little bit of your soul, this works just fine. Yes?
Again, can you go back a few slides? I'm really interested in being able to...
I went quick because there's beer after this. I apologize.
I'd like to be able to run a legacy X application inside of a container, so I'm very interested in this particular incantation.
So this incantation right here works. I will add caution that it makes SE Linux really pissed off. I can't imagine why. When we looked at putting EL5 into a container, and we actually ship that one as a base container. You can go, Docker pull CentOS :5 and pull down an EL5 Docker container. We ship those. We decided not to ship EL4 or 3 or anything else, even though it works, because it's end of life and we don't want to have to support that or deal with it. I bring it up here because we're already talking about terrible things. So the upside is with with EL3 as a container. That's a 2.4 kernel base. It has no concept of SE Linux, so no patching involved. With EL5, I went to Dan Walsh and asked him, hey, EL5 is still technically supported. Can we have an SE Linux patch for this? I'm not smart enough to do this on my own, because if you looked at the SE Linux code, so Dan actually got with a couple of his guys, and about 6 hours after I made the request, I had a patch. It was fantastic. We put that in, we rolled out EL5 containers, and because we were already working backwards, I wanted to see what else I could do. We successfully did EL4. And I didn't want to go back to Dan after that and say, hey, can we have an EL4 patch for this? Because that's like going to your dad and saying, I spilled paint in the garage. I'm not mad, I'm just disappointed. I didn't want to do that to him. I like Dan. I want Dan to respect me, and I don't think he will if I do that. So, other questions? What other evils do you guys have that you would be interested in putting into a container? We talked about WebSphere. We're looking at legacy X applications. What else are you guys running that's hanging out there? Is it in-house software that you've written and just can't shoot in the face? I see a couple of you nodding and laughing. One guy looks like he's about ready to cry. I'm sorry I brought up painful memories. Yes.
I think the two cases, and you're alluding to them, is one where something's locked down to a particular hardware because it's a commercial thing that you don't want to pay for the next version of it. But the other is what I call the haunted house, which is like people have done things to it and figuring out what it is. It's just not
or it's
you actually just want to in most cases, you just sort of want to snapshot what's there and run a piece of hardware and move it.
I want to be able to yank the plug, take the hardware, throw it in the trash, and move on with life. If you do Docker save and you pull that image off, you're just burning a little bit of hard drive space. It can still run. You expose just the ports you need for that application so people can talk to it, and that's it.
Well, and you're probably talking about boxes that are like 4 or 5 years old, and that's their...
At least.
Yeah, so...
We're not talking about stuff that's covered by warranty or, license agreements or anything else.
It's going to be so much faster, and you probably have more RAM and, SSD
Mm-hmm.
and whatnot, so it's going to barely dent a newer box running that stuff on there.
Right. You will actually see a vast performance improvement just from kernel tweaks that have happened in, from the 2.4 kernel to the 3.10 kernel.
It's like those Apple
There's a little bit, yeah.
ran too fast to play the game.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we're talking about giving an older application from, the early days of EL4, hey, you've got a 10 gig network card now. You've got 192 gigs of RAM. Go nuts.
So I guess that goes back to his question, though. Can you get in there and lie about the hardware MAC address or change it?
Absolutely. You can absolutely do that. And the reason that I jumped to FlexLM as my initial example was exactly for that. On Linux, most of the FlexLM licenses that you'll see are tied to the MAC address for the hardware. Lie about the MAC address. It's fine. So, to be fair, you can lie about a MAC address with virtualization platforms too. It's tying to MAC address is an old idea that is obsolete now. But hey, that's what we're talking about. So yay.
So it works if everything's on a switch, right?
Yep. Questions, other stuff. So it's not necessarily, because I came from a sysadmin background, a lot of the hand-waving DevOps, here's best practice, here's, the constant release cycle, a lot of sysadmins they want that flexibility, but they don't necessarily have it because they have to support that thing from way back in the past. So, yeah. The future, one of the things that, and I'm going to invoke his name again, Dan Walsh has been working on, along with a bunch of other people, is super privileged containers. Managing the host from inside a container. So, I'm seeing a couple of, Take your basic diagnostic tools. Take GDB, take strace, take, systat, and a lot of the stuff you use to debug your system, and don't install them. Put them in a container. Remember how I was talking earlier about abusing your volume mounts? You can mount the root volume. And as a super privileged container where you're essentially giving it all the rights to the network card, the namespace within the kernel, because at that point you're sharing kernel namespace for processes with the host, you can see everything. So there's a whole range of just wide open evil possibilities for things that we can do there that Dan is looking at, and I haven't had the chance to sit back and scratch my head and say, okay, how can we make this even worse? If you want to actually look at what he's doing with that, it was just pushed to the Project Atomic GitHub. Was it yesterday he pushed that in?
Which thing?
The actual Atomic project within, the Atomic command went into the Project Atomic GitHub yesterday. I urge you to go check it out. There's some really cool things in there that are terrifying.
I think it requires 1.5.
It does. It does require a newer Docker version. Along with that, one of the other things that has one of the things that the Atomic command uses is the concept of labels. You can associate a label with a Docker container, and that container or that label allows you to establish. The best way that I could describe it would be a pre-install or post-install command for RPMs. You can actually identify how that container is supposed to be run from within the Docker file itself. You give it a label, you give it your command string, that's how your container runs. So it lets you get a little crazier than, this is lesser evils compared to what he's working on, and it's fantastic. Yes?
So you mentioned if you have a kickstart file and are able to kickstart up, let's say, a
Mm-hmm. Exactly. That's all the base containers that we generate now for 5, 6, and 7 that we publish. It's all a Kickstart script, and we put those Kickstart scripts out there. On my blog site, I did the EL4 Kickstart that I used to generate that container. I won't put that in our actual Git tree because, oh God, I don't. As much as I'm talking about this and I'm telling you not to go do these things, you know, I don't necessarily want to encourage quite to that level of putting it in Git and, hey, go do this.
But I mean, you've got instructions on building an EL4 box in the container.
Yes. No.
So are you saying you're kickstarting to build the image using VM, KVM?
So what we initially started doing this with was a tool called AMI Creator, written by Jeremy Katz. So we've been using that for 5, 6, and 7, which was essentially just, hey, we made a little 8 gig disk. We do a bare install into that disk. We strip out the junk that we don't need. We tar that out, and the resulting file is what we need to import into, you know, Amazon or wherever else. We have a number of cloud images that run a little more complete than what I'm doing. So like I said, we don't need grub, we don't need the kernel, we don't need sysinit files. There's a whole range of stuff that we just, you know, chuck it out. When you're done, that VM will absolutely not boot. It'll sit there and look at you like, what did you do? But just fine for Docker. Any other questions? No? Excellent. Okay. One more. Yes.
Are your slides online?
No. Should they be? I'm not sure if this type of stuff would get me convicted of something elsewhere. So it's a question of how much evil do we want to encourage, and yes, I realize the hypocrisy of standing up here preaching it and then saying, no, please don't do this, dear God. All right, alcohol and therapy sessions are available after this, so enjoy.